The flyer trembled in my hands. The girl's face was mine, but the name wasn't. My husband's footsteps pounded up the stairs. I shoved the evidence into my bag, but Silas lunged first, his fingers clawing for the truth. The tripod cracked against his skull, 1 second to run. And then I saw my father on the porch, his smile gone, his eyes calculating my escape. Too late to hide, too late to pretend. The car engine roared to life, but the road ahead was already a trap. Dust motes danced in the shafts of gray light, piercing the attic's slatted vents. Sarah Miller knelt on the rough floorboards, the scent of cedar and stale dampness clinging to her sweater. Her fingers trembled as she pried open the rusted latches of her mother's steamer trunk. Inside, beneath a pile of moth-eaten wool blankets, lay a stack of yellowed newspapers. She shoved the heavy fabric aside. A single sheet of paper, crisp despite the humidity, slid from between the pages of a 1994 ledger. Sarah smoothed the creases against her thigh. The bold lettering across the top screamed, "Missing," but the grainy photograph underneath stole the air from her lungs. A girl, no older than 5, grinned into the camera. Her dark hair was pulled into messy pigtails, exposing a distinct, crescent-shaped birthmark high on her right temple. The floorboard creaked behind her. Sarah froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She reached up, her fingers grazing the patch of skin just below her hairline, where she applied heavy concealer every morning. The mark was there, a perfect mirror of the ink on the page. The paper felt sharp, a jagged edge of reality cutting through the hazy comfort of her life in Cape Cod. This wasn't just a coincidence. It was a blueprint of a stolen life. The air in the attic grew heavy with the smell of old paper and the metallic tang of fear. She could hear the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock downstairs, each second a hammer blow against the foundation of her identity. "Is someone up there?" Her husband, Mark, called from the hallway below. Sarah folded the flyer, the paper sharp against her skin. "I'm clearing out the old linens, Elias." Her voice sounded thin, a stranger's tone. She tucked the flyer into her waistband, the edge biting into her hip. Outside, a crow shrieked from the oak limb, scratching against the shingles. The house, once a sanctuary of inherited memories, suddenly felt like a cage constructed of secrets. She moved deeper into the shadows of the attic, her knees scraping against the wood. The trunk wasn't empty. Beneath the newspapers sat a smaller wooden box, bound in iron. Sarah pulled a small pick from her camera bag, a tool she used for adjusting tripod legs. But today, it served a darker purpose. With a soft click, the lock gave way. Inside were bundles of letters and a thick, blue folder. She opened it to find a birth certificate for Sarah Miller. But the paper was too white, the ink too raised. Beside it lay a medical report from a hospital in Portland, Oregon, dated 3 weeks after the date on the flyer. The blood type didn't match the records she'd seen in her father's study last year. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. Every birthday cake, every scraped knee comforted by Eleanor, every graduation photo, it was all theater. She wasn't a Miller. She was a ghost living in someone else's house. She pulled out her digital voice recorder, her thumb hovering over the button. "Subject is standing in the attic," she whispered, her voice a mechanical rasp. "The air is 55 degrees. The documents in the trunk indicate a structural failure in the family history. The birth record is a forgery. Verification is required." She heard footsteps on the stairs, heavy, deliberate. Not Mark. These were the slow, dragging steps of Silas, the caretaker who had been with the family since before she could walk. Sarah scrambled to shove the folders into her leather camera bag, the heavy metal of her professional tripod clanking against the floorboards. She had to move. The attic felt like it was shrinking, the sloped ceilings pressing down on her shoulders. "Miss Sarah?" Silas's voice was a low rumble, like stones grinding together. He stood in the doorway, a mountain of a man, silhouetted against the dim light of the hallway. He didn't move toward her. He simply blocked the only exit. He was humming, a low, dissonant tune that vibrated in Sarah's chest. It was the sound he made before he had to do something unpleasant. A funeral dirge for her innocence. "I'm just finished, Silas," Sarah said, her heart racing at a frantic tempo. She gripped the strap of her bag. "I was looking for some old photo backdrops." Silas's eyes moved to the open trunk, then to the bulge in her bag. He didn't offer a polite smile. Instead, he stepped into the room, his massive frame casting a shadow that swallowed her. "Mr. Miller said those trunks were to stay shut. He said the dust up here isn't good for your lungs." He reached out a hand, calloused and stained with engine oil. "Let me take the bag, Sarah. It looks heavy." "I've got it," she snapped, stepping back. She felt the rough brick of the chimney press against her spine. Silas didn't stop. He moved with a predatory slowness. When he lunged, it wasn't with a shout, but with a sharp intake of breath. His fingers clamped onto the leather strap of her bag, pulling her forward. Sarah didn't think. She reacted. She swung her heavy aluminum tripod with both hands. The metal whistled through the air and connected with Silas's forearm with a sickening thud. He groaned, the low hum breaking into a hiss of pain, and his grip loosened just enough. Sarah shoved past him, her shoulder hitting his chest like a runner hitting a wall. She scrambled down the attic stairs, the wooden steps groaning under her weight. She burst through the kitchen, the smell of Eleanor's lavender tea cloying and suffocating. She didn't look for Mark. She didn't look for her mother. She ran straight for the mudroom and out into the salt, heavy air of the driveway. Her Volvo sat idling, a silver escape pod. She threw the bag into the passenger seat and slammed the car into reverse, the tires spitting gravel against the manicured hedges. As she swung the car toward the main gate, she looked up at the house. On the wraparound porch stood Thomas Miller. He wasn't waving goodbye. He stood perfectly still, his silver hair gleaming in the overcast light. He was rotating his heavy gold signet ring 1, 2, 3 times. His face, usually a mask of paternal concern, was cold and vacant. He watched her flee not like a worried father, but like a hunter watching a bird fly into a net he had already woven across the sky. The drive to Portland felt like a descent into a fever dream. The farther she got from the coast, the more the landscape blurred into a gray smear of asphalt and pine trees. By the time she reached the city limits, the sun had vanished, replaced by a relentless drizzle that turned the neon signs of the motels into bleeding sores of light. Sarah checked into a budget motel on the edge of the city, a place that smelled of industrial lemon cleaner and old cigarettes. She sat on the edge of the bed, the blue folder spread out before her. She needed to know who the girl in the flyer was. The name at the bottom was Maya Vance, missing since June 1992. Sarah picked up the phone to call her bank, needing to ensure she had enough to disappear for a while. "I'm sorry, Ms. Miller," the voice on the other end said, clinical and detached. "There is a flag on your accounts. Your father, as the primary on the trust, has placed a temporary hold due to suspicious activity." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Thomas hadn't just watched her leave. He had reached out across the state and snapped the leash. She was in a city she didn't know, with $40 in her pocket and a car that would eventually run out of gas. She looked at her digital recorder. Financial access severed. Subject is isolated. The perimeter is closing. Sleep didn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard Silas's low hum and the rhythmic click of Thomas's ring. The next morning, she walked out to the parking lot, her boots splashing in the oily puddles. She stopped dead. All 4 tires of her Volvo were shredded, the rubber hanging in ribbons. Taped to the driver's side window was a small silver locket. Her fingers shook as she opened it. Inside was a tiny, curled lock of dark hair and a scrap of paper with 3 words. Give it back. The threat was a physical weight. They knew where she was. They had followed her through the rain and the dark. Sarah didn't call the police, not yet. She grabbed her bag and began to walk toward the city center, her eyes darting to every passing car, every shadow in a doorway. She reached the public archives, a brutalist concrete building that felt like a fortress. Inside, the air was still and smelled of floor wax. She spent hours scrolling through microfiche, the light of the screen burning her eyes. She found the Vance case. It was a lead story for months. A 5-year-old girl taken from a park while her mother was distracted for 60 seconds. The lead investigator was a man named James Peterson. She looked for a connection to the Millers, her fingers flying across the keyboard. A shadow fell over the desk. Sarah didn't look up, but she felt the hair on her arms stand up. "You're a long way from the Cape, Sarah," a voice whispered. She turned. Standing in the aisle was a man in a rumpled tan coat, his eyes bloodshot and weary. He was counting under his breath. 1, 2, 3, as he looked at the stacks of books. It was the man from the police reports, James Peterson. But he wasn't a cop anymore. He looked like a man who had been chewed up by the truth and spat out. "Did they send you?" Sarah asked, her hand sliding into her bag, gripping the heavy flashlight she'd packed. "They don't need to send me," Peterson said, his voice a dry rattle. "I never stopped looking. But your father, he's a very thorough man. He buys things. People, evidence, silence." He stepped closer, the smell of stale coffee wafting off him. "You have something he wants. That ledger, the birth records. If you give them to me, I can help you." "Help me or help him?" Sarah challenged. She backed away, her heels clicking on the linoleum. "There's no difference in this town," Peterson said. He lunged, his hand reaching for her bag. Sarah didn't hesitate. She pulled the canister of pepper spray from her pocket and squeezed. A cloud of orange mist hit Peterson square in the face. He howled, clutching his eyes, his counting turning into a string of curses. Sarah turned and bolted, weaving through the maze of bookshelves. She burst out the back exit into a foggy alleyway. The mist was so thick she could barely see her own hands. She ran until her lungs burned, eventually collapsing onto a bench inside a passing city bus. She stayed there for 3 loops of the route, watching the city blur past. She needed a win. She needed someone who wasn't bought. She got off at the central police station, the harsh white lights of the lobby making her squint. "I need to report an assault," she told the desk sergeant. A woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Miller. Sarah flinched at the name. "And I have information on a cold case, the Vance kidnapping." The sergeant paused, her pen hovering over the paper. "That's a 30-year-old ghost, honey." "Why now?" "Because I'm the ghost," Sarah said, pulling back her hair to show the crescent mark. The sergeant's expression shifted from boredom to a sharp, clinical interest. She signaled for a clerk. Take her to the records room. Get her a terminal." While she waited for a detective, Sarah used the public terminal to dig into the 1992 medical records of the hospital where Maya Vance was born. She looked for names, nurses, doctors, anyone who might have been on shift that day. She found a list of staff. One name jumped off the screen: Brenda Thompson, neonatal lead. Sarah pulled up Brenda's employment history. Before the hospital, she had worked as a private nurse for a wealthy family in Massachusetts, the Millers. And Brenda wasn't just an employee. Her maiden name was Eleanor's maiden name. Brenda was Eleanor's sister. The room seemed to tilt. This wasn't just a crime of opportunity. It was an inside job, a family project. Her Aunt Brenda had helped her mother Eleanor steal a child to fill a hole in a broken life. A sympathetic clerk leaned over her shoulder. "Finding what you need?" "I'm looking for Brenda Thompson's statement from the original file," Sarah said, her voice trembling. The clerk tapped a few keys, her brow furrowed. "That's strange. There's a note here. A redacted statement from Witness B. That's Brenda. It says the abduction was facilitated by a staff member who provided the exit route through the service elevators. But the statement was never used in court. It was buried by the district attorney's office." "Who was the DA back then?" Sarah asked. The clerk scrolled down. "A man named Robert Hayes. He's an FBI assistant director now." The web was larger than Sarah had ever imagined. It wasn't just her parents, it was the law itself. Every hand that had touched her life had been greased with Miller money. She felt a wave of nausea. She wasn't just a victim. She was the evidence of a 30-year conspiracy. She left the station before the detective arrived, her paranoia now a screaming siren in her head. She had to find the one person who truly lost something. She found an address for Diane Vance. Not a house, but a hospice center on the outskirts of the city. The facility was quiet, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and fading flowers. Sarah found the room at the end of the hall. Inside, a woman sat in a wheelchair, wrapped in a thick wool blanket despite the warmth of the room. Her skin was the color of old parchment, her eyes sunken and clouded. "Mrs. Vance?" Sarah whispered. The woman turned slowly, a heavy, rattling sigh escaping her lips. "If you're here about the bill, talk to the front desk. I've given them everything I have." "I'm not here about money," Sarah said. She walked forward, stepping into the light. She reached up and pulled back her hair. Diane Vance froze. Her breath hitched, a jagged sound in the quiet room. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers hovering inches from Sarah's temple. "Maya?" "I think so," Sarah said, her voice breaking. They talked for hours, Diane's voice a fragile thread of memory. She told Sarah about the park, the blue dress, the way the sun had looked that afternoon. But then the conversation turned dark. "I'm dying, Maya," Diane said, her voice flat. "My kidneys are failing. I was at the top of the transplant list 6 months ago. Then, suddenly, I was moved to the bottom. They said there were irregularities in my file. A medical foundation did an audit and found I wasn't a viable candidate for long-term recovery." "What foundation?" Sarah asked, though she already knew. "The Miller Health Initiative," Diane sighed. "They've been very kind, sending flowers, paying for my palliative care. They said they wanted to help the victims of tragedy." The cruelty was breathtaking. Thomas wasn't just hiding the truth. He was actively killing the only person who could claim Sarah back. He was using his wealth to ensure Diane never lived to see justice. "I have to go," Sarah said, standing up. "I'm going to fix this, I promise." Don't go, Diane pleaded, her hand clutching Sarah's sleeve. They'll take you again. I can't lose you twice. They never had me, Sarah said firmly. They only had a version of me they built. I'm taking the rest back. She spent the next 48 hours hunting for Brenda Thompson. She found her in a rusted trailer park 3 hours north of the city. The trailer smelled of bleach so strong it burned Sarah's throat. Brenda was a shell of a woman, her fingers raw and bleeding from constant picking. Sarah didn't ask. She demanded. She set her phone on the laminate table, the recording light a glowing red eye. I know about the service elevator, Brenda. I know about the Witness B statement. And I know about the money Thomas paid into your offshore account every month for 30 years. Brenda collapsed. The guilt she had been scrubbing at for decades finally broke through. She spilled everything. The way Eleanor had sat in the car, weeping with joy as she held the stolen child. The way Thomas had handled the paperwork with the DA. The way they had told Sarah her real parents were dead, so she would never look for them. I have the bank records, Brenda sobbed, pointing to a shoebox under the bed. I kept them, just in case. I knew he'd try to clean me out eventually. Sarah took the records and the video confession. She had it. The smoking gun. She drove to a secluded lakeside cottage she had rented under a false name, feeling a momentary surge of triumph. She would call the FBI. She would go to the press. But when she opened the door to the cottage, Thomas Miller was sitting at the small wooden table, a glass of water in front of him. He was straightening the placemat, making it perfectly parallel to the edge of the table. You've been very busy, Sarah, he said, his voice calm, almost disappointed. Get out, Sarah said, her hand on the door. We need to talk about Mark, Thomas said, rotating his ring. He's a good man, a rising star. It would be a shame if the police found the files I've placed in his office. Embezzlement is such a messy charge. It follows a man forever. Even if he's innocent, the taint never leaves. You wouldn't, Sarah whispered. I've spent 30 years protecting this family, Thomas said, standing up. I will protect it for 30 more. Give me the phone, Sarah. Give me the records. We'll go home. We'll tell everyone you had a breakdown. A little time in a quiet facility, and this will all be a bad dream. He moved toward her, his hand outstretched. He wasn't the father who had taught her to ride a bike. He was a machine of cold, calculated malice. When he reached for her bag, Sarah grabbed a pair of heavy kitchen shears from the counter. Don't touch me, she hissed. Thomas laughed, a short, dry sound. You're a Miller, Sarah. You don't have the stomach for... He didn't finish. Sarah lunged, the shears catching him in the shoulder. He roared in pain, stumbling back. Sarah didn't wait to see the damage. She grabbed her bag and ran out the door, plunging into the dark woods surrounding the lake. She ran until her heart felt like it would burst, the branches catching at her clothes like skeletal fingers. She reached a clearing and pulled out her phone. She had one contact left, the man the police clerk had mentioned, Robert Hayes. If he was FBI, maybe he could be swayed by the sheer volume of evidence she had. Subverted beat 3.5. Sarah leaned against the rough bark of an ancient oak, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She pulled her phone from her pocket, the screen's glow blinding in the pitch-black woods. She dialed the number for Agent Robert Hayes. He was her last hope. The clerk had said he was the one who handled the original file. And surely, even if he'd made mistakes in the past, a man in his position couldn't ignore a video confession and 30 years of bank statements. Agent Hayes? A deep, authoritative voice answered on the second ring. My name is Sarah Miller. No, my name is Maya Vance, Sarah said, her voice shaking but determined. I have the evidence. The confession from Brenda Thompson, the financial records. I know what the Millers did. I know what you did in 1992. There was a long silence on the other end. Sarah held her breath, listening to the static. "Where are you, Maya?" Hayes asked, his tone shifting to one of fatherly concern. "I've been waiting for this call for a long time. The guilt, it's a heavy thing to carry. I want to make it right. I can protect you. I have a safe house 3 miles from your current location." Relief washed over Sarah like a physical wave. Her shoulders dropped, and she let out a sob she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you. Oh God, thank you." "I'm sending a car now," Hayes said. "Stay off the main road. Follow the fire trail north. My man will be there in 10 minutes. He'll have a blue light in the window. You're safe now, Maya. The Millers can't touch you." Sarah moved through the woods with renewed energy. The fear that had been her constant companion for days began to recede. She reached the fire trail and saw the car, a black SUV with a small blue light pulsing in the corner of the windshield. The driver stepped out, a tall man in a suit who gave her a crisp, professional nod. "Ms. Vance, Agent Hayes is waiting." Sarah climbed into the back seat, the leather smelling of newness and safety. She handed her bag to the agent. "It's all in there. Everything you need to take them down?" The agent smiled, a warm, reassuring expression. "You've done a brave thing. Relax. We'll be at the field office in 20 minutes. Sarah leaned her head against the cool glass of the window. She watched the trees flicker past, her mind already beginning to plan how she would get Diane the surgery she needed. The nightmare was finally ending. Then she noticed the driver's hand. He was wearing a gold signet ring. It wasn't the same as Thomas's, but it bore the same crest, the seal of the Miller Health Initiative. Her heart skipped a beat. She looked at the dashboard. There was a tablet mounted there, and a notification popped up. A message from R. Hayes. "The package is secured. Transferring the monthly retainer to the trust account now." The world tilted. Sarah lunged for the door handle, but it was locked. The child safety lock. "What is this?" she screamed, pounding on the glass. The driver didn't look back. His voice was cold, the warmth gone. "Agent Hayes has been on the Miller payroll since he was a beat cop kid. You didn't find a savior. You just delivered the evidence back to the people who paid for it to stay buried." The car sped up, the blue light continuing to pulse, a mockery of the protection she thought she'd found. Subverted beat. 3.6, Sarah huddled in the corner of the seat, her mind racing. She had to get out. As the car slowed for a sharp turn, she used her heavy camera tripod, the one thing she'd kept in her lap, to smash the side window. The glass exploded in a shower of diamonds. She threw herself out of the moving vehicle, tumbling into the wet ditch. She didn't stop to look back. She scrambled into the brush, disappearing into the darkness just as the SUV screeched to a halt. She ran until she reached a small town, finding a 24-hour diner with a flickering TV in the corner. She sat in the back booth, her clothes torn and muddy. She looked up at the screen. A news report was playing. "Breaking news in the search for Sarah Miller," the anchor said. Sarah's heart hammered. Maybe they were looking for her to help. The screen shifted to a press conference. Thomas and Eleanor Miller stood at a podium, looking devastated. Beside them was a man in a sharp suit, Robert Hayes. "We are deeply concerned for our daughter's safety," Thomas said, his voice thick with feigned emotion. "Sarah has struggled with severe dissociative identity disorder since she was a child. She has these episodes. She imagines a different life, a different family. Eleanor sobbed into a silk handkerchief. She's stopped taking her medication. She's dangerous to herself. She's even begun to believe she was kidnapped. We just want her to come home so we can get her the psychiatric help she needs. Hayes stepped forward, holding up a file. The FBI has reviewed Ms. Miller's medical records. They confirm a long history of institutionalization and violent outbursts. We are treating this as a missing persons case involving a mentally unstable individual. If you see Sarah, do not approach her. Call the authorities immediately. The screen showed her medical records. Perfectly forged documents showing years of therapy sessions that never happened, signatures from doctors she'd never met. Sarah stared at the screen, her reflection in the dark window, looking like the madwoman they were describing. By labeling her insane, they hadn't just discredited her evidence. They had made her a prisoner of her own identity. No one would believe a crazy girl over a pillar of the community and an FBI director. She was no longer a victim. She was a fugitive from a truth no one wanted to hear. She sat in the back of the diner, the smell of burnt coffee and grease thick in the air. She had no money, no phone, and the entire country was looking for a woman who didn't exist. She looked at her hands, raw and shaking. Subject is compromised, she whispered into her lapel, though the recorder was gone. The narrative has been rewritten. The frame is broken. But then she remembered the metadata. As a photographer, she knew that every digital image carried a fingerprint. The proof photos the Millers had shown the press, the ones of her episodes, they had been taken recently. She found a public library and used a computer, her fingers flying across the keys. She pulled up the news segment and zoomed in on the background of the photos Hayes had displayed. In the reflection of a polished metal surface behind the distraught Sarah, she saw a logo, a stylized M inside a gear. The Miller Warehouse. It was a private facility on the docks. That was where they were keeping the original Vance file, the one Hayes had lost 30 years ago. They hadn't destroyed it. Thomas was too much of a hoarder for that. He kept his trophies. Sarah spent the next night infiltrating the warehouse. She used her knowledge of the Miller estate's security, the same systems Thomas used everywhere, to bypass the alarms. The air inside was cold and smelled of salt and diesel. She found it in a false-bottomed crate in the back office. The original file. The real birth certificate. The police reports with the original, unredacted statements. She didn't run this time. She sat at the desk and opened a laptop she'd stolen from the break room. She didn't call the police. She called Jennifer Clark, a reporter she knew had been silenced by Thomas years ago. "I'm going live in 5 minutes," Sarah told her. "Make sure the world is watching." The 70th birthday gala for Eleanor Miller was a sea of silk and diamonds. The ballroom of the Miller estate was filled with the elite of Cape Cod, the air cloying with the scent of lilies. Thomas stood at the head of the table, raising a glass of vintage champagne. "To Eleanor," he said, his voice booming, "the heart of this family." Suddenly, the massive projection screens behind him, intended for a slideshow of family memories, flickered to life. But it wasn't photos of summer vacations. It was Brenda Thompson's confession. It was the original Vance kidnapping file. And in the corner of the screen, Sarah Miller stood in the warehouse, holding up her birth certificate. "My name is Maya Vance," she said, her voice echoing through the silent ballroom. "And these people are not my family. They are my captors." The guests gasped, their faces pale in the blue light of the screens. Eleanor let out a strangled cry, her pearls snapping and scattering across the floor like teeth. Thomas lunged for the control panel, but it was too late. The feed was being broadcast to every major news network in the country. The police didn't arrive to help Thomas. They arrived with handcuffs. The fallout was a tidal wave. Thomas and Eleanor were led away in the back of a cruiser, their faces shielded from the flashing lights of the paparazzi. Robert Hayes was arrested at his office an hour later. Months later, Maya Vance sat on a porch in Oregon. The air was crisp, smelling of salt and pine. Inside the house, Diane was sleeping, her new kidney functioning perfectly, her color returning. Maya looked down at the crescent-shaped mark on her temple. For 29 years, she had tried to hide it, to cover the flaw in her perfect life. Now, she saw it for what it was. A map. A permanent reminder of who she was before the world tried to tell her otherwise. She picked up a new camera, one she had bought with her own money, and framed the shot of the sun setting over the Pacific. "Subject is home," she whispered, not into a recorder, but to the wind. "The light is natural. The foundation is solid. Everything is finally fine."